Now, the so-called ceasefire, which in practice wasn't a ceasefire in the conventional sense, has obviously formally been destroyed, and huge numbers of people are again being violently killed in Gaza. There's been a total siege on Gaza now since the beginning of this month. At the same time, within Israeli society, there's been some quite interesting developments concerning Netanyahu. There's the dynamic, obviously, with Donald Trump being in power and what that means, not least with the proposed, in practice, forcible removal of the entire Palestinian population from the home. There's always, I have to say, whenever I've chatted to Ori Goldberg, people have always had a brilliant response. He's a great analyst based over in Israel, and I've chatted to you a few times now, Ori, all the way through this horror. And your analysis, your thoughts, your insights. People have always been delighted to hear from you. So great to speak to you again. How you doing?
I'm okay, as well as can be expected. Like you say, these are very, very dark times.
Very dark times indeed. I'm just interested first because I've not spoken to you since Trump was elected and became president again. What do you think about the change in dynamic? I mean, what do you think the kind of real practical changes we've seen?
Well, we haven't seen much change in the United States support for Israel carrying out its genocidal policies, but I think we have seen a real change in the American orientation. And it's not the change the Israeli right expected. I think Trump very clearly and overtly really doesn't give a damn. He doesn't care about Palestinian lives. But he also doesn't feel particularly beholden to Netanyahu. There's been tension there ever since the end of his previous term when Netanyahu tried to present himself as the whisperer in Trump's ear. You remember the whole scandal, the cartoon, I think, was it in the New York Times or in the London Times? Netanyahu walking Trump on a leash.
Oh yeah, New York Times.
New York Times. So Trump doesn't like Netanyahu and doesn't necessarily trust him. He may feel obligated to some senior Republican donors, namely the widow of the late Sheldon Adelson, the gambling tycoon Miriam Adelson. But Miriam Adelson doesn't necessarily like the Netanyahus either. So what Israel has is an America that supports it in terms of goods delivered. Trump freed up the bombs that had been held by the Biden administration. But Trump's emissary to the Middle East, Stephen Witkoff, really genuinely doesn't seem like he feels as though he owes any of the parties in the region any particular debt. And that's very confusing to Israelis, and certainly confusing to Netanyahu. In many ways, Trump called Netanyahu's bluff when he said, I'm supporting Israel, whatever Israel decides to do. Because I think Netanyahu and the Israeli right saw this as an unconditional statement of support and as a fervent endorsement of their ideology. But what it in effect means, I think, in Trumpish, is as long as you deliver what I need you to deliver, I'll support you. Once you don't, if you're seen as a loser, if you're seen as losing the people's confidence, if you're seen as teetering, if you're seen as faltering, then I don't think Trump will have any kind of compunctions removing his support from Israel or placing his weight behind a Saudi proposal or an Emirati proposal. There's a lot of things going on there as well. So in that sense, Israel is confused. It isn't. It's getting support from the United States, but the support is somewhat mechanical. And the good relationship that Israel had with the Biden administration is not really there anymore. I don't think the Israelis know how to comport themselves with the Trump administration.
I mean, what do you think about the plausible implementation of what is described, well, what in practice would be ethnic cleansing? I mean, I spoke to genocide scholars. They said it would be a genocidal act in itself. You forcibly remove the entire people from their home. It's an incredible amount of genocidal violence involved in that. But what do you think about do you think that's a likely prospect?
I don't at this stage, but not because it was floated fictitiously. It wasn't. and it certainly reflects or gives voice to a sort of a collective Israeli fantasy that's shared by Israelis of all political stripes, which is not to kill the Palestinians, but that the Palestinians would disappear. I remember this question from just political chats among friends. And the answer was always obvious. The question was, if you had a big red button you could press, and the next day the Palestinians wouldn't be here, are you saying you wouldn't press it? And the answer was always, of course I would. Nobody wants the Palestinians here. And if there were people who were a particularly righteous turn of mind, they would say, obviously the Palestinians would answer the same way. They'd also press the button. So I think the Trump plan, as it was once called, I don't think it's a plan any longer, is a very big deal because it has allowed Israeli society and Israeli politics to begin speaking this language. Just today, we heard from Prime Minister Netanyahu in his beleaguered speech in the Knesset, where he said, or his Minister of Defense said this as well, if the Gazans don't get rid of Hamas, then we will be forced to take their land. There's nothing to take that hasn't already been taken. Israel has already occupied Gaza 6 or 7 times easily over the past year and a half and can do so very easily again. It's not facing any kind of threat. But I think Trump himself has really distanced himself and his administration from this plan because he's basically said as much. He said directly, nobody's going to be forcefully expelled. And that's not because he's a great humanitarian, but because I think somebody sat him down and explained the logistics of ethnic cleansing to him, explained how he would appear in American media and in the global media, but also how much money it would cost, and Israel's inability to pay for it, and the need to process, that's the word Israelis are using now, 10,000 people a day leaving, which is what our Minister of Finance, Smotrich, bragged about. So the main reason I think this won't be carried out is because it is too much of a hassle. But when I talk about that, we have to take into consideration the hidden debate that's going on in Washington right now over influence regarding the Trump administration between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the sponsor of the Arab League plan, so-called Egyptian plan, that talks about reconstruction. The Emirates want something a lot looser that would allow them to control Gaza through their own proxies. So they're encouraging Trump to apply pressure to Egypt to accept tens of thousands of Palestinians. I don't think Trump is leaning that way. His emissary Witkoff certainly isn't, but it's all there. So what I would say is it's not going to go through, I think, but because Trump would see it as way, way too much of a burden. Not because people are against it, okay? Because practically speaking, which for Trump is a big deal, it's not particularly feasible.
It's interesting that quote you said before about Palestinians vanishing. Yair Golan, the leader of the Democrats, supposedly the progressive opposition, he once said, we'd all like to wake up one spring morning and find that 7 million Palestinians who live between the sea and river have simply disappeared. I mean, the point there about what Israel's behavior is, it kind of has to work. It worked backwards from that point based on what it sees is politically, diplomatically possible at any given time. As in, as you said, that would be a nice dream which unites as far as much of the Israeli establishment is concerned, but it's not. The question is always about feasibility. So what we've seen over the last year and a half is that becomes, what wasn't seen as feasible before becomes more feasible.
I'm not arguing.
Yeah, I was putting that to you. Sorry, no, I was just putting it to you.
No. Certainly it does. But I think I don't even have words to aptly describe the atrocities of the past 8 days since Israel broke the ceasefire. I think they may have been the worst days since this whole thing began, in terms of just the sheer disregard for the sanctity of life. Really, just the horror it exceeds literal descriptions. And I think what is visible, though, if you're looking at it, try to look at it closely, try and analyze what Israel is doing, is that really Israelis, just in a very, very simple yet profound way, don't care. They don't care. They've got bad guys. I mean, the narrative has been simplified to an almost ridiculous extent. The past 2 months have not happened. There hasn't been a ceasefire. There's no deal. There's nothing there. Other than that, Israelis don't care in the sense that Palestinian lives are completely without value in their eyes, without significance. They're not worth preserving. They're not worth defending. Israel goes after its so-called targets, which it alone defines, through a vast web of misinformation and lies, as though targeting Hamas's political leadership right now is what destroys the existential threat that Israelis face. But the more important thing is that really Israelis are not even pretending to act legally anymore. They're just going after the targets because the targets are the only ones that matter. Palestinians have two choices. One is to be bad guys, officially recognized as such by Israel, and the other is just not to exist. Israel is not doing much of anything by causing them to physically evaporate, by eradicating them, because they're not really there to begin with as far as most Israelis are concerned. And if they are, then, well, they chose Hamas and they support Hamas, and that's the path they took, and they could have taken another one, so they deserve to die. But most Israelis aren't even there. For most Israelis, I just read, this is an anecdote, but before we started talking, I just was browsing on my Hebrew Facebook feed. I'm that old, yes. And somebody has a Facebook group devoted to London. Okay, that's his pleasure. He uncovers London for Israelis. So he went on a trip and he caught a lot of theater during his time there. So he saw a play. I don't know what it's called in English, but the Hebrew name he presented was something like "Knocking on the Roof," which is the Israeli protocol for warning Palestinians that they're about to bomb buildings. And he wrote, this is just an ordinary guy. He wrote, I watched this play. It's pretty good. And then in parentheses, he said, of course, I didn't feel any pity because the whole premise is based on an attempt to erase October 7th. So why would I pity them? But the play in itself was pretty good. This isn't a politician. This isn't a Hasbara tycoon. This is a guy talking about plays in London. But he feels a need to add this disclaimer because that is the greatest virtue Israelis can have right now, not caring. Okay? It's not even, yes, we've got our share of Death Eaters. And they're certainly there. There's certainly people who are ideologically committed to wiping out Amalek and to killing Palestinians and so on and so forth. But most people derive a sense of virtue from statements like that. Because why would I have any pity for them? Or why would I think about them? There are endless expressions of this throughout Israeli discourse. Some of them have to do with the demonstrations against Hamas that just took place. But in every case, Israelis need to either demonstrate their complete lack of care or respect for Palestinians, or to place the burden of proof for why Palestinians should be kept alive on Palestinian shoulders. Show us why you're worthy of not being bombed. That's also another trend that's coming to dominate Israeli discourse. Go into the streets and demonstrate, and then we will have a discussion on whether our drones should bomb you as you demonstrate or not. Are these demonstrations genuine? Israelis want to know. I'm sorry, I'm ranting, but
no, not at all. No. I mean,
it's horrible.
Well, it's something I'm very interested in because it's become something of a cliche, but you see a tweet from Israel and you hit the press translate button, translate from Hebrew into English, and you're like, oh my god! I mean, it's just. Yeah, I mean it's fascinating because it's always been the case this has happened in lots of societies in lots of ways where people otherwise show love and empathy and feel grief and all the rest of it, and if they saw something terrible happening, they would to a woman in the street or a man in the street or a child in the street, they'd be like devastated, they'd be traumatized, they cry at a sad film, they cry at an animal being killed in a film, and yet this hasn't. I mean, it's a disturbing case study. I mean,
have you ever read Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Huh?
I as a child, I did, yeah.
So the third volume, Life, the Universe, and Everything. It starts with uh, the story of the Cricket Wars, the people of the planet Cricket, whose planet was surrounded by a vast dust nebula. And for thousands of years, they lived precious, carefree, pleasant, good lives until one day a spaceship came crashing down from the nebula and revealed to them that they were not alone. And right there and then, they decided to embark on a quest to destroy the entire universe because they were no longer alone. You know, and Douglas Adams, being the genius that he was, describes it very aptly. How just before the spaceship crashed, they were walking along, the cricketers singing a song about life and love, and after a second after the spaceship crashed, they were singing songs about life and love and destroying the whole universe. So, in many ways, this is what is happening here. Good people, smart people, people who fully understand the concept of responsibility and the concept of consequence. When it comes to the Palestinians, for a lot of reasons, some of them have to do with attrition, because life in Israel is, of course, it's not life in Gaza, but life in Israel is deteriorating rapidly. But even if you don't want to talk about attrition, or we don't want to talk about attrition, for a broad variety of reasons, these people are simply not there. They don't care, especially now when they can care about a lot of domestic Israeli events that are so, volatile and everything is happening. The protests are renewed and so on. But the consensus that is underpinning the great turmoil of Israeli politics is that Palestinians are not worthy of concern or respect or care. Their lives are, ashes to be scattered at most, nothing more.
I was going to ask you about what's going on in Israeli society, but just on this, in Ynet, the online portal of Yedioth Ahronoth, which is the biggest, for those who don't know, biggest circulation newspaper in Israel. And this was an article about Herzl Halevi, the former chief of the general staff of the Israel Defense Forces. And it said this about the aftermath of the 7th of October. When Halevi presented the IDF's operations to the cabinet in the first 48 hours of the war, he noted the Air Force had attacked 1,500 targets in Gaza. This is a huge number, requiring exceptional intelligence and operational capabilities. Netanyahu erupted in anger, yelling and banging on the table, "Why not 5,000? He scolded the chief of staff. "We don't have 5,000 approved targets," Halevi replied. "I'm not interested in targets," Netanyahu retorted. "Take down houses, bomb with everything you have." I'd look at that and it's just like, that's got no coverage in the Western media. No
coverage. Not surprising. It's got no coverage in the Israeli media either. But I don't think it's an intentional attempt at subterfuge here in Israel as much as it really is. What the hell are you talking about, dude? I mean, this quote unquote war is generally described as the most just war Israel has ever fought. Okay, and there's no expiration date. We are always the just ones here because what happened to us was, and here I'm using another mantra, the worst massacre perpetrated upon the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Once you've got massacre and Holocaust in one sentence, you can't be beat. And yes, the IDF started right off the bat by basically carpet bombing, supposedly going after targets. But as this piece, which by the way nobody bothered to deny, which I suppose means it's true. I have an acquaintance who's a top-ranking military officer, and I had a conversation with him about 2 months after October of 23, and I asked him if this activity really was, as intense and as maximal as it seemed. And he said it wasn't maximal because nobody had ever dropped so many bombs before. Not in any war Israel fought, not in any war the Israeli military was familiar with. This just had never happened. So yes, the floodgates were opened right at the beginning, and nothing has really changed in that sense. Which is why when people talk about a kind of a grand master plan coming to fruition here, this is Israel doing what it planned on doing all along. I disagree, and I don't think it makes it less horrible. I think it makes it more horrible. I think that what happened really is that Israelis, right from the start, received an approval to treat their fantasies, which are not meant to be realized, as practical goals. And again, the fantasy is for the Palestinians not to be there. So you take any means necessary. You establish a directorate for ethnic cleansing. You bomb the entire Gaza Strip, lifting all the international humanitarian legal defenses for non-combatants. You supposedly distinguish between civilians and combatants, but effectively you don't. All of these things are kosher, again, because ultimately at their foundation lies nothing. That is the point Israelis are trying to make. We don't care. Don't try to make us care because you're not going to succeed. We don't. And because we don't care, what does it matter if we killed one child or 10 children or 50 children? We got the bad guy we wanted to get. Those Palestinians should have done their math and made the proper choice when they had a chance to do that. They didn't. It's on them. It's not on us.
With Israel, I want to ask you about what's happening there. Can you just kind of explain what's going on with the economy in Israel? Where do things stand at the moment?
Oh, they're very bad, and they're only going to get worse. Netanyahu's government just passed the 2025 budget. It's a budget that's full of money earmarked for sectorial partisan needs by the parties that make up the coalition, and it cuts severely into social services, into investments in infrastructure for the first time, in decades. The defense budget is higher than the education budget. And generally speaking, civic life in Israel has taken quite a blow from this budget. It's only going to get worse because Israelis have not really begun to pay in terms of salaries for the war. Cost of living rises preposterously. Prices rise nearly every week. We haven't reached Weimar Republic standards just yet, but that might be where we're going because there's no salvation on the horizon, no investors waiting to flock into Israel and care for all the orphaned high-tech developers. This was always a speculative economy. That's something that this government did before it became the genocide government. It was the privatization government. If Netanyahu has an ideology, it's as close to Thatcherism economically as I've ever seen. So that was what this government was doing. And our chickens have come home to roost now that we've lost the reserves, the financial reserves that we had. It's all about plunder by specific political parties and a very severe and rapid erosion of the social safety net for ordinary citizens like me.
What is going on at the moment, as you would see it, in terms of the head of the Shin Bet, which is the domestic security services in Israel, has been dismissed. And you know, at the moment, there's a scandal involving Benjamin Netanyahu in his office and the Qatari government and possible corruption. What's your general take on what's actually happening there, and the kind of growing authoritarianism and how much that's actually happening?
It is happening. And Netanyahu's government is trying to pass a series of laws that will cement its control over the judiciary, provide it with almost complete freedom in appointing judges and at all levels of the judicial system. There's no doubt they're already trying to postpone the elections meant to be held in 2026 by a year because of some technical loophole. There are laws that have been proposed and are on the Knesset's agenda for that will make it very easy to disqualify Israeli-Palestinian parties from running in elections should elections take place. All of this is actually happening. But Israel, or the protesters who protested against Netanyahu before the genocide began, returned to the streets because of the scandal over the dismissal of the head of Shin Bet. I will remind your viewers that Shin Bet is not just Israel's domestic security service, it's also the security organ that's charged with the day-to-day maintenance of the occupation of Palestinian territories. The military upholds the physical side of it, but Shin Bet directs espionage and other intelligence efforts that have to do with the territories because of their unique status. And I don't know if you can even call it irony at this stage that Israelis clamoring for democracy are defending the one senior Israeli security official who's probably the least beholden to democracy in our less than democratic country. The thing is, this all became very, very obvious and very clear to a lot of people. The Shin Bet was investigating relations between people who were quite close to Netanyahu, who were close media advisors, and the Qatari government. I don't know that there's necessarily a whole lot to these allegations. Israel's relationship with Qatar is a complicated one. Qatar was the only Gulf country who was friendly to Israel and who had discreet diplomatic relations with Israel as far back as the 1990s. Qatar served as mediator at Israel's request between Israel and Hamas. It was also Hamas's patron, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Israelis who are against Netanyahu and against Netanyahu's government and against the war, but don't feel like they can, again, be against the war because of the genocide, are using this Qatar Gate scandal to legitimate their protests and to suggest that the prime minister hastened to dismiss the head of Shin Bet because the head of Shin Bet was directing the investigation against him. Remember that Netanyahu is also on trial for 4 counts of bribery at various levels, and you'll get a sense of how beleaguered the prime minister is. It's now or never for him, both on the Gaza front and on the domestic legal front. And he is apparently all in. You know, he's betting the house that he will win and that the protest will subside. My sense is that the protests are different than they were 2 years ago. They are much more angry. Netanyahu has really lost all inhibition in pursuing his own personal path to salvation. And a lot of Israel's elites, but not just the elites, people who don't like him and don't trust him now consider him much more dangerous than he was. The really interesting bit, which I don't know if we'll get a chance to see it, has to do with real fears among Israel's military leadership and also political leadership that should the government decide on an occupation of Gaza, tens of thousands of soldiers will not report for duty because the war will be seen as a political war and because Israelis have served literally hundreds of days on the front lines and businesses have crumbled, families have dissipated, and generally the fabric of social life in Israel has suffered greatly because of this
Benjamin Netanyahu, in response to all of these goings on, I guess, declared there will be no civil war. And it's sort of thing you listen to if you're concerned about a civil war, you would be more alarmed about, I would say, than that. But I mean, is that is that just completely fantastical nonsense? Is that just trying to kind of rally unity around him?
Well, it's more of a mantra. In Israel, the notion of Jewish supremacy is very closely linked to Jewish fraternity. Ultimately, there was a time when Jewish factions fought each other under the British mandate. And the Haganah, which later turned into the IDF, the central dominant faction that ultimately created the Israeli state, turned members of the Irgun and Lehi to the British authorities and fired on a ship full of new immigrants that was sponsored by the right-wing militias. And ever since then, there's apparently a sacred oath that neither side will lift arms against the other side because ultimately, you know, we're all in this together. We're all Jews. If we don't take care of each other, nobody will. That is even more pronounced now because everybody hates us anyway. So unless we do it, no one will go through the trouble. So again, it's more of a mantra than it is anything else. Additionally, if you'd asked me 2 years ago, I would have said I don't really see the prospect of civil war as realistic because the ones who are talking about a war, the Death Eaters, are more like cowardly lions when it comes to actually acting. But things may have changed. They've had a year and a half in the military. all their inhibitions have been lifted. They are used to killing. They've killed at an industrial level. I don't know if they will think much about killing in-house now. I think they will. I think there are still inhibitions in place. I don't see a civil war there, but it remains to be seen. In Israel, in some contrast to, let's say, a country like Romania, the ethos of national unity is paramount. This idea that we have to stick together, because if we don't, then all of our enemies will congregate and screw us royally, is very, very powerful, very tangible. I think Netanyahu is counting on that, but the protests are not letting up. There are thousands of people in Jerusalem right now trying to do their best to disturb public life, disturb the peace, if you will. I don't think they'll stop the Netanyahu government from passing the laws it wants. It has a solid parliamentary majority. But I can't be as certain as I was about where this will go. Once again, though, it's worth reminding everybody listening and watching that this isn't being carried out because of the genocide. As far as the genocide goes, there's consensus. The genocide is supported far and wide. This is another element of what I think of as our solipsism, our murderous solipsism, where we are concerned only with ourselves because we are the only real thing there. This, in a way, is another assertion of the fact that the only thing that matters is Israeli politics, not, for example, the plight of the Gazans who are being slaughtered as we speak by our sons. The pilots who bombed Gaza, I'm sure many of their parents are out in the streets protesting. It didn't stop them from bombing Gaza. We've had several conscientious objectors come forth and refuse to serve. Very brave, but very few. The great majority have not done so.
Just a couple of final questions. I mean, one was linked to where this is all heading. I mean, what's your sense of where things are heading in the West Bank?
Well, I understand that a new plan has been issued, and if I recall the language correctly, it meant to radically alter the narrative of refugeeism, tear down the refugee camps and make them into permanent settlements. Except for the destruction and the mayhem and the deaths, all of Israel's statements regarding the West Bank at the moment are bogus. You can't trust them. You can't see a direction there. The settlers are using all the power they have because they are politically savvy. They understand that it's now or never. And they are using all the power they have to try and establish their presence in the territories. More than 10,000 apartments have been approved for building in the territories during 2025. That's already about twice as much as were approved throughout the entirety of 2024. But that deserves to be said. That's certainly a power grab. I don't think we can tell much from that about where this is heading. I don't know where this is heading. This is virgin territory for Israel. We've never committed full-on, overt, documented genocide. Certainly not at the level we've done with which we're doing so now. We've never had a prime minister accused of and indicted on so many charges, with public rage finally being fueled consistently. Again, none of this is happening for the right reasons. None of this is happening because Israel is acknowledging its responsibility for the genocide. None of this is happening because of the genocide. The genocide is the consensus. But things are happening, and now it's coming down to the sociology of it. Sociology and the economics, perhaps. And there are a lot of quiet parts that are not being spoken of out loud, like the issue of whether soldiers will show up if a ground invasion of Gaza takes place. I don't think they will, so I don't think it will. But Israel will shed a lot of Palestinian blood before anything resembling calm descends upon the region. I pray that the saner voices in the Trump administration prevail and find a way to bridge the gap towards enforcing the Arab League plan, which seems like the only real show in town. Nothing else actually exists, even if there are devious Emirati wishes to try and divert this course. That's the only plan that exists. It's the only commitment that exists. It's probably the only solution there is.
Yeah.
I know where I want this to go, and I know where where it seems like the only place it can go. I can't see Israel continuing to do this forever, despite Netanyahu's desires. This is all going to reach a boiling point sooner rather than later. I'm afraid that in the time it takes to reach the boiling point, an enormous amount of Palestinian blood will be shed, and the need to remember what is being done to the Palestinian people, not by Israel directly, but by a world enabling this, I think should be the punchline of any discussion we have about all of these events.
Well, that's what I was gonna. That's what I was gonna finally ask. I mean, you say it'll end up at boiling point at some point, but will it? I don't know. I mean, what's different here compared to many other atrocities committed, of which there are no shortage in our species' gruesome past, is it's just this level of impunity. So there's nothing really just stopping. There's no counter. There's no counter pressure. Not really. Not in a meeting. You've got a superpower on your outside. You can kind of get away with anything.
You're absolutely right. The only thing that will stop this will be if the house of cards that is Israeli democracy will tumble, will collapse. And I think this case is fairly unique because of the length, the duration of time during which Israel has enjoyed this impunity, and which has allowed it to construct this very elaborate tower of lies. The lies are, to some extent, unraveling, and I wish I could say more comforting things. I don't know. Maybe they won't. Maybe they won't. Maybe Israel will keep battering Gaza for months now. And perhaps I'm being an optimist because I really can't envision life going on in Israel, and I am Israeli, and I live in Israel, and this is where I am. I may be too much of an optimist, but looking around, I don't think the Israeli fabric has enough resilience in it to last much longer. It is, again, no comparisons, obviously, but life in Israel really is deteriorating very quickly. In the sense not of impending doom, but the sense of unraveling is very powerful. The sense that the state is no longer there, that there's no trust to be had in the state, that this Jewish fraternity we talked about, which is much more accessible than the notion of supremacy, that this Jewish fraternity exists no longer, is very much there. I don't know if this unraveling will be enough. I can, however, say that if it doesn't unravel from within, it's unlikely to unravel from outside.
Always ever fascinating stuff. Always very hard hitting. That's the nature of what we're talking about. But and very sobering stuff as well. I have to say, it's always such a pleasure. For those listening, watching, do share this video. Make sure, obviously, press like, subscribe, all the rest of it. Leave comments because then more people engage and why we're here. But honestly, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you and hear your wisdom. So thank you as ever.
Thank you, Owen. It's always a pleasure it's always a pleasure to talk to you. It's always a pleasure to have time to have a conversation. We need, everybody needs more of this now. Everybody needs more truth. And you do truth. That's very commendable.
I do my best, but so right back at you. It means a lot for you. Cheers, buddy.